पृथिवी शान्तिरन्तरिक्षगं शान्तिर्द्यौः शान्तिर्दिशः शान्तिरवान्तर दिशा शान्तिरग्निः शान्तिर्वायुः शान्तिरादित्यः शान्तिश्चन्द्रमा शान्तिर्नक्षत्राणि शान्तिरापः शान्तिरोषधयः शान्तिर्वनस्पतयः शान्तिर्गौः शान्तिरजा शान्तिरश्वः शान्तिः पुरुषः शान्तिर्ब्रह्म शान्तिर्ब्राह्मणः शान्तिः शान्तिरेव शान्तिः शान्तिर्मे अस्तु शान्तिः. May there be peace on earth and in the sky. May there be peace in the water and in all directions. May there be peace in the plants, in the trees, and in animals. May there be peace in the hearts of all beings. May there be peace in everyone and in everything. Sarvetra sukhinas santu, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschit dukkha bhag bhavet, sarvastaratu durgani, sarvo bhadrani pashyatu, sarvas sadbuddhimapnotu, sarvas sarvatra nandatu. May all be happy and healthy. May all see what is good, and may no one experience misery. May all overcome their obstacles and acquire good tendencies. May people everywhere find joy and fulfillment. Let us now spend some time touching the center of peace and joy in our hearts. A good way to begin the practice is to withdraw the scattered energies of the mind and bring them to rest on one point. That point can be our own breathing. Let us therefore practice breathing with awareness. As we breathe in, let us visualize that our body and mind are being filled with love, strength, and compassion. And as we breathe out, let us release all the stress, anxiety, and exhaustion in the body and mind. Let us practice this way for a while. Let us now turn our attention to the region of our heart. Although God is present everywhere and in everyone, the divine presence can be felt most clearly in our own hearts. We can meditate in any way we have been taught. To remain focused, we can take the help of a short mental prayer or a mantra or a divine name. Let us now spend some time dwelling on the presence of God in our hearts. Shanti 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 Harihi Om. We are very happy to have in our midst today Dr. Jacob Meskin, some of you may remember he spoke here 13 years ago. And although he doesn't live very far away, so it's been a long time since he visited here last. So those of you who are hearing him for the first time, Dr. Jacob Meskin is currently senior lecturer in the Maya program at Hebrew College, a program dedicated to adult Jewish education. In addition to teaching for several other programs at Hebrew College and at various synagogues in the Boston area, he often works as a teacher, trainer, and educational consultant. Dr. Meskin was the inaugural holder of the Ruderman Chair in Jewish Studies at Northeastern University and has taught at Princeton, Rutgers, the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Yeshiva University, Williams College, and Lehigh University. His articles have appeared in Educational Philosophy and Theory, Modern Judaism, the Journal of Religion, Soundings, Levinas Studies, Judaism, Cross Currents, and several edited volumes. Despite being a transplant from New York City, Jacob has become an avid Boston sports fan. His hobbies include chess, Go, 19th century English novels, old movies. Only old?
Mostly old.
Mostly old, okay. And Indian vegetarian food. He lives with his wife, who is here with us today, and his daughter in Brookline. Please welcome Dr. Jacob Meskin.
Good morning. Thank you for coming out this morning. I'd like to thank Swami Tyagananda for having me out. He did have me here once before, and he's had me out again, which means something. That it was 13 years, I'm still trying to interpret. Maybe if I do a better job this time, it'll only be 5. We'll have to see. At any rate, I consider it to be a privilege to talk to you this morning. Let me do what we are always supposed to do in giving a talk and tell you quickly what I'm going to talk about before I actually talk about it. What I want to do is say a few introductory words about Judaism, and then define 2 traditions of Jewish spiritual seeking. One is called Hasidism, and one is called Musar. I will have to translate these terms, just as in Sanskrit terms translated into English. It isn't that simple to find the right English term, but I will do my best. Hasidism you might call a kind of popular piety with an emphasis on feelings and emotions, and Musar you might call spiritual self-perfection. Before I say that, though, I want to make a few opening remarks. The first remark to make is, I want everybody to immediately understand that being interested in spirituality and talking about spirituality does not mean you are spiritual. I just want to put this up right. There's a sort of misconception that if you talk about spirituality, you must somehow be beyond temptation. You must live in a kind of ethereal realm. So I have various quotations from famous figures to make this point. The most famous one, if you're educated in the classic Western canon, is St. Augustine. In the Confessions, after he's described his illicit ways of drinking and endless fornication, he looks up to God and says, God, give me chastity, give me freedom from lust, but not yet. The idea appeals to him, but he doesn't want to rush. Okay, so I think this gives us a little bit of license to say you can find the topic of spiritual introspection, spiritual work, interesting without somehow holding up a sign that you're such an accomplished person. You may simply have gotten it into your head that it's an interesting idea and maybe a good one. I have another story about a famous rabbi. We will encounter some of his ideas later from the Musar movement, the self-perfection movement. This rabbi was running a special yeshiva, a special institution for education that attracted men who were very serious, young men in particular, about working on their character. And after a while, one of his young men came to him and said, you know, Rabbi, I don't need to be in a special yeshiva. I can pursue my spiritual self-perfection out in the world. I don't need to be here. So the rabbi looked at him and said, you're a young man. What will you do out in the world if you find yourself with all the different women there are in the world? Won't you be tempted? And he said, Rabbi, I simply won't look. And the rabbi said, my son, I am 92 years old. I have practiced spiritual self-discipline for over 60 years. I still look. So again, this is a rabbi doing this a long time who is under no illusions about the day-to-day nature of his life and what he's really after. And finally, one more of these, and then we'll get back to the next point. This is my favorite quotation from Oscar Wilde, who is not a rabbi and not a guru, but a wise individual. He said, "All of us lie in the gutter, but some of us look up at the stars." So again, it's okay to be interested in spirituality without the claim going forth that you're a saint. Next topic, what does the word spirituality mean? So if you go online, you will find endless articles and books about this topic. I am not going to attempt to define spirituality today. It's a lot of work. I'm just going to make a sort of obvious observation. You might say that spirituality is an attempt to think beyond your own limits and to act beyond your own limits. More precisely, spirituality is the attempt to think in 360 degrees, not 90 degrees, not 180 degrees, to actually see how you see from your own egocentric perspective. But not only to see it, to also try to change it. Both are involved. So in that sense, spirituality means ceasing the activity of not seeing. I realize that's a lot of negatives, right? So let's put it in the positive way. Actually working on seeing the stuff you don't want to see. Easy examples. All of us have egos. Easy examples. All of us age. We are all mortal and finite. Those are difficult thoughts. I try very hard not to think about them. Sports is an excellent way, especially when Boston teams are winning, not to have to think about the mortality of the flesh. Sports doesn't have to be used as a way of distracting yourself, but of course it can be. All things can be. So spirituality would be the beginning of some sense of, wait a minute, there's a bigger picture I'm part of here. What does that picture look like? And how could I live, at least to some degree, with a knowledge of that bigger picture? So that's two pieces of the talk. One more piece, maybe the most interesting one for most people. I'm going to talk about spiritual traditions in Judaism. What is Judaism? Okay, so I do this for a living and I still don't have any idea. One thing we'll start off with, it's very long. I have a friend who likes to quip, life is short, but Judaism is long. The Jews have been around a long time, and a quiet people they were not. They wrote and wrote and wrote. The last talk I gave here was called The Jewish Obsession with Books, and most of what I did for 45 minutes was talk about the number of books that the Jews produced. Starting, by the way, interestingly, with the Bible, which is the Word of God, but it is a big book. If you ever compare the New Testament and the Hebrew Bible is vast. Its vastness means that when you comment on it, there's lots to comment on. I had a friend going to a yeshiva who used to say, we would have been better off not being the people of the book, but the people of the pamphlet. But it's too late. We're the people of the book. So Judaism, whatever else it is very large. By the way, those of you who've studied your history of Hinduism know the Hindu tradition is full of books as well, starting with the Vedic canon and the endless commentaries thereon, the Upanishads, the Gita going forward, the Puranas, all the medieval philosophical literature. It's mind-bending how much there is to read. So cancel your subscription to Netflix, get out your texts, and talk to Swamiji because he knows far more about that than I do. At any rate, so one of the things to say about Judaism is that, like Hinduism, there's a vast amount to learn. Another thing I think I need to say about Judaism is the central religious dynamic in all of religious Judaism sounds very simple. It's a commanding God telling the Jewish people to do things. Quick quiz question for extra credit. Do the Jews do what God tells them? No. Okay, you all pass. There's a tremendous amount of gnashing of teeth, a tremendous amount of disagreement, a tremendous amount of, in Yiddish we say, kvetching, endless complaining. It's all throughout the Hebrew Bible. So the dynamic in Judaism, which might seem superficial, is a God who recognizes that human beings are individual and may disobey, and nonetheless tells them to do things. Sometimes when they don't do it, he gets very mad. Sometimes when they don't do it, he tries to coax them. Sometimes when they do it, he's very nice. But the thing that never gets fixed is it's always two, God and humans. And the dynamics that creates are very interesting. Human beings are expected to be capable of being responsible. They'll fail, but they can live up to being responsible. Moreover, it's not just two. When God tells you, love your neighbor as yourself, or in more colloquial English today, don't be a schmuck, which is sort of a drop-down translation, right? It doesn't mean don't be a schmuck to yourself. What about all the other people in your life? Your family, your friends, people at work, your pets, the larger world. All of those are involved in the commandments. So I had a teacher in graduate school who used to say, if you need one idea about what God is, he's a sort of a busybody. He's a nudge. He's an annoyer. He keeps saying, do this, don't forget about this, feed the poor, feed the orphan, be just. And when you say, I can barely take care of myself, God says, it doesn't matter. You're a responsible adult. You work it out. That dynamic, that driving sense that there's a higher level you're supposed to strive for, is a dynamic we're going to see throughout everything we study today. In addition, of course, just one more comment, Judaism is many other things as well. It's foods and family traditions and amazing men and women who somehow persevered in the face of persecutions. It's customs, it's ceremonies, it's music. Just like all large extended religions, it lives in many levels. An intellectual level of books, and a day-to-day level of families gathering around a table and eating a food that was first made by somebody's great-great-great-great-grandmother hundreds of miles away and thousands of years ago, and that's been preserved. That's also in Judaism. So although we're going to be talking today about some more, I want to say esoteric, it's not really the right word, more specialized traditions, please remember the traditions are assuming a community of real flesh and blood people living real flesh and blood lives. So that's some of the introductory work I wanted to do with you, just to give you a sense. Needless to say, this really can't be done, what I'm trying to do here in 45 minutes, but I'm trying to give you at least some sense. So having said that, let me begin with my first of the two different Jewish traditions I want to talk about. And there are more, by the way. I just want you to realize that, like all religions, Judaism has things in it that are complex and you may have trouble with, that I have trouble with, Jews have trouble with, and things that are glorious, like spiritual traditions. And I just want to talk about two of them. The first one is called Hasidism. The word Hasid is a Hebrew word that means a pious individual. Hasidism is a movement that, in a funny way, existed throughout Jewish history. There were always Jews who tried very hard to live according to the commandments. The movement we call Hasidism today, by the way, ism isn't a Hebrew ending, it's an American ending, right? It's an English ending. But in Hebrew you say Hasidut, but no one knows what that means. So Hasidism. In the 18th century in Poland, a man named Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer, who was very learned in Jewish mysticism, had a kind of a revelation that the way of pursuing mysticism that the few great scholars and saints did was wrong. He was called at his time in Hebrew the Baal Shem Tov, Hebrew for the master of the good name. What it seems to mean is that this man had a knowledge of the mystical names of God, which he could use in certain quasi-magical and medical ways. Nonetheless, he decided to put this knowledge to use in founding what we call today a popularizing movement, where he took these very exalted mystical notions and knocked them down to life, where day-to-day people could use them. Let me give you some examples. The very isolated, esoteric Jewish mystics would spend all of their time studying the Torah, the Hebrew Bible, and all of the commentaries and all of the mystical commentaries, and mostly stayed away from people. They tried to stay in ecstatic personal states where they could view the higher heavens left alone from the problems of day-to-day life that might distract them. They felt also, in a way, that when they could get to the higher levels, they could have some awareness of their achievement and come back to other mystics and say, today, I reached a very high level of mystical awareness. Finally, they also realized that their bodies and their lusts were a constant struggle and were really a negative. The Baal Shem Tov, the founder of this movement, decided all of those were wrong. So the first thing he said is, you don't have to study a book to get in touch with God. God is available everywhere. Studying a book is going to make you full of yourself. You're going to be arrogant. So that's not a good idea if you want to know about God. Don't study. Somehow you'll need to connect with God in a much more direct way. And that direct way will be called prayer. or prayerful meditation. We'll come to that in a second. The next thing the Baal Shem Tov said is, these men who go off by themselves in caves, what about their families? What about their friends? That can't be right. It's fine to have flashes or moments of intimacy with God. You don't need 48 hours. If you get 15 minutes, you're doing fine. So don't feel you have to leave the world to be a mystic. Moreover, this idea that you could go up to a high level of awareness and come back and talk about it, you don't have to go anywhere, he says. God is everywhere, filling the world at all times. If you were just aware of it, you wouldn't have to leave. You wouldn't have to go to a cave. You wouldn't have to leave your body. You just feel God's presence. And finally, he said, these men who think their bodies and their lusts are a problem do not appreciate that God made those bodies and God made those lusts. So this is a very interesting idea. Now, at the time, just think about this for a second. At a time, you have a rabbi who looks like all the other rabbis saying to his fellow rabbis, guess what? All those negative attitudes you had, they're all wrong. What do you think the response was to this man from the community? They just loved him. They gave him an elevated chair at the university. Not at all. They tried to hound him out because he was too radical. But his followers grew and grew and grew. And as you can see, as we'll talk about this, is a very powerful kind of popular message. I have an example here, which I won't read just in terms of time, but I want to give you the sense of it. He was asked, Rabbi Israel, the Baal Shem Tov once, why do we say blessings when we eat a piece of fruit? And he gave a very famous explanation. He said, you say a blessing when you eat the piece of fruit because the fruit tastes good. Why does the fruit taste good? He says, God has managed to contract an aspect of the full presence of God into the fruit. When you say it tastes good, you are, now this is going to hurt the head, or maybe not for you guys, but hurt most people's heads, that you are tasting God. You're tasting divinity. You are using the senses you have in your nervous system to give a sense of what God is like based in your body. When you say a blessing, you're acknowledging the profundity of enjoying the piece of fruit. You're saying, I'm not just eating a good piece of fruit. I'm connecting with God's presence in the piece of fruit. By the way, as I say this, I think, could I ever do this? Like, I eat something delicious. Could I remember that the food and the pleasure aren't just, wow, this tastes great, as opposed to, wait, this tastes great because something magical is happening here. Not magical, something godly is happening here. It's a very powerful idea. Your day-to-day life is full of these sorts of things, but we don't generally pay attention, and we certainly don't pause all the time to, quote-unquote, thank God for this. We don't think about anything bigger. The Baal Shem Tov also said, all Jews are required to pray. Now, let me just stop for a second. Have people here been to a Jewish synagogue service? Okay. Were they long? Yes. Okay. They are very long. You guys have a very economical idea here. The Orthodox Jewish service is something like a minimum of 2.5 hours on a Saturday morning. Some of the other services are longer. They're none of them short. There's a whole regimented series of prayers you're supposed to say at certain times. And again, if you think that all Jews are sitting there deeply, piously praying these prayers for 2.5 to 3 hours, you're a very nice person. They are gossiping. They are chatting. They're talking about the latest trade that the Red Sox made. They're wondering if the Celtics can come back. Because it's very long. So you sort of endure it. Even though there are moments of profundity in it. So the rabbi we're talking about, the Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer, said, you Jews are getting your prayer service all wrong. It's not supposed to be endlessly long. It's supposed to be ecstatic. You don't understand what you're actually doing when you pray. So with your permission, I want to read you some quick snippets of some comments he made about the Jewish prayer service, which will not require any knowledge of the service, but maybe some knowledge of human nature. In this particular one, he addresses some words all Jews are supposed to say before an important prayer. As a person begins to pray, he or she recites the words, O Lord, open my lips and let my mouth declare your praise. That is to say, the presence of God comes into him or her at that very moment. Then it is the presence of God herself who commands his voice. That is to say, the feminine presence of God speaks the words of the prayers through the man praying. One who knows in faith that this is happening within him will be overcome with trembling and with awe. This is very interesting. I've said these words many times. O Lord, open my lips, let my mouth declare your praise, just as a sort of a preamble. He's saying, take it literally. What does it mean? O Lord, open my lips and let my mouth declare your praise. It means, okay, God, I'm giving control of my computer system to you. You do it. So he's saying, then when you start praying, you're not praying. God is praying through you. That's an incredibly scary, radical idea. Or it's a sense of nearness to God, that you're always a vessel that can somehow be open to God speaking through you. A very powerful notion. I'm going to read you another little snippet. In the Psalms, in the Bible, it says, such and such is the prayer of a poor man. But the Hebrew text could be translated rather not a prayer of a poor man, but rather a prayer made to a poor man. Why would you pray to somebody who's poor? Here's the explanation of our rabbi. Though the treasure houses of the king are full, they are managed by the king's officials. Having nothing to do with all his treasures, the king himself is like a poor man. One who comes in search of treasure when praying will never see the king. Only one who seeks no riches, who prays to God as to a poor man, that person could see the king. I do this one with my students a lot. What can you get from God if God can't give you that new Maserati and that new jacuzzi? If God's not in that business, what do you get? Why pray? So my students are mostly adults, and they often eventually say, well, what could you get from a friend who can't give you money? What do we get from our friends? Relationship, presence, comfort, connection, a feeling that we're not alone in the world? Maybe that's why you should be praying to God. Maybe it's not about stuff, it's about intimacy. Again, a very simple idea, not one it's so easy to keep in one's mind. One last little snippet like this. The rabbi we're talking about, Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer, the Baal Shem Tov, was asked this question. Why is it that every time I stand up to pray, the worst thoughts enter my head? The thoughts are always about things that are forbidden. Forbidden foods, forbidden sexual relations, forbidden money deals I might make. Why is it that just when I start to pray, those thoughts come in? By the way, you can try this experiment yourself. I've tried this empirically. It does seem that there's quite a bit of... The minute you say, I am now going to do something religious, somebody else in your head says, what about... So let's see what he has to say about this. It's a very interesting commentary. Some of you, if you are social workers or psychologists, might recognize the reasoning. Even distracting thoughts that confound you during prayer, they may be a good sign. There is a palace surrounded by many walls. In it lives a king. At each entrance to the palace, there is a guard posted who keeps people from approaching the king. If a petitioner comes to see the king and the guards see he is of no importance, the guards don't bother with him, for he's of no importance. They will allow such a person to enter the palace undisturbed. In any case, they know the king will pay no attention to him. But how different it is when a respected noble of the kingdom tries to come before the king, one with a request that could endanger the position of the guards themselves. At that point, the guards try to put that noble off in whatever way they can, telling him to leave and come back some other time. How they try to keep him from the king, for surely his words would be accepted by their master. All of this is a parable about prayer. When you realize you are being kept away from the king, gather up all your strength and cry out in anguish, Father, save me. God longs to hear his people's prayer. One cry can open all the gates. Who are the guards? The guards guard the palace of the king. When somebody unimportant comes, the guards don't care. The unimportant person can see the king. When the important people come to see the king, the guards try to keep the important person away from the king. You are the important person when you pray. You are trying to reach God. The guards don't want you doing that. How do the guards do this? They show up in your head as thoughts about all the wrong topics when you're trying to pray. But if that is the case, that is to say, if every time you try to pray to reach God, you have inappropriate thoughts, who are you in our parable? You're the important person. You're the noble person. You're the person that God might actually want to talk to, not the unimportant one. So what does that mean? It means that if you're besieged by inappropriate thoughts when you pray, you're doing the right thing. It's a good sign. Your prayers matter. Don't give up. Someone's trying to stop you. You're important. Sort of like in those spy movies or detective movies where the hero gets beat up and they say, stay off this case, buddy, or you'll get it. It means you're on the right track. So the same thing is true in this prayer explanation. You're on the right track and should keep it up. So unfortunately, Swami Tyagananda told me I could go until 12. So you're stuck with me for a little while longer. Just one more piece of this. So we're talking here about prayer. So far we've talked about prayer in the sense that it might actually connect you with God in a much more emotional and intimate way. But there is one more metaphor which I think you'll find quite amazing that this rabbi uses about prayer. And this one I do have to read to you. I don't think I could make this one up. So this is a bit out there. He is talking about how to understand studying Torah the right way and prayer the right way. And he's talking about ecstatic, what he calls ecstatic prayer. This prayer we do every day is not a ritual to be done by rote. It's ecstasy when you do it the right way. And here's what he says. The rabbi gave an interpretation of the verse from the book of Job. The verse is, "And from my flesh I will behold the Lord." This is to say the following. The expression, "from my flesh I shall behold the Lord," means just as a physical union is not consummated unless the member is aroused and there is desire and joy, it is also so in the spiritual union. That is to say, during prayer of ecstasy, when it is done with the member aroused and with joy and delight, in that moment it is consummated. So this is a very radical sort of thing to say. You can see why this rabbi could have easily gotten into trouble. Did you follow that analogy? It's quite remarkable. He seems to be saying that just as two human beings, when they feel great passion and lust for one another, find their bodies physically aroused and so can consummate their union, similarly, in prayer, you must be aroused, else it isn't union. This sort of makes your head swim. The implication seems to be that prayer at the highest levels is, if we could imagine such a thing, something like a sexual union, something like that with God. This is far beyond my own experience, but it's fascinating he would even go into this kind of territory. But this shows you the radicality of what he's saying. He's not saying you have to be a great scholar to do this. You just have to be a human being to do this. But you have to understand that prayer is love. Prayer is a full encounter with God. At any rate, these will give you some of the ideas of this particular tradition. In this tradition, and there are more examples here, but I'm sort of looking at the clock here. In this particular tradition, day-to-day life, eating, family life, sexuality, working with other people are all aspects of a kind of relationship with God. No special study is required. No super elevated intelligence is required. What's required is emotional honesty and emotional availability. And for the Baal Shem Tov and for the followers of Hasidism, of course there are followers today, this movement still teaches these same things. I'm often asked by my students, if I go out into the street and look at one of those men with the hats and the funny hair by their ears and the long black suits, will they all agree with all of this stuff? And the answer, of course, is no. But they'll all recognize that the man, the rabbi we're talking about, is the founder of the movement that they all come from. When you institutionalize ecstasy, it doesn't work as well. I have nothing against the Hasidic movement. There are lovely, wonderful Hasidic individuals, but I'm talking about something larger than that. If you read these texts, you will think every single person who is a follower of Hasidic Judaism is a deeply moved person in connection with God. Some of them are. Some of them aren't. It's what you would expect in any world religion. People are all different. So that's the sense I want to give you, that you have to remember at the same time as we read this, that we're talking about flesh and blood people. I will now take you just to my second tradition, and we're coming down the home stretch here. This is the tradition of Musar. Musar is a funny word to translate. It literally means discipline. But it doesn't exactly only mean that. It means, I guess the simplest thing to say it means today is working on the traits of your character. So let me tell you a little story about the history of this movement. A man we're going to talk about who founded this movement is called Rabbi Israel Salanter. He was born in 1810 and died in 1883 in Lithuania. At the time, the Lithuanian Jews were controlled by the Russian Empire that was mostly trying to persecute them, oppress them, make them assimilate into the Russian Empire. And Rabbi Salanter felt that the thing that was hurting the Jews was that they weren't treating each other well. The Russians already weren't treating them well. They weren't treating each other well. So he designed a movement that was based on this idea. Jews know what they're supposed to do. It says in the book, be nice to each other, treat each other well. They never do it. Why? Because it's a teaching that stays in the head. How could you get the teaching out of the head and into the guts of people so they would do it emotionally? So he took this old idea, the old idea is how do you actually live up to your religious ideals, and founded a new movement. And his new movement he called Musar, ethical self-discipline or self-examination. His basic idea is we are said in the Bible, all of us, to be made in the image of God. Our bodies, our minds, made in the image of God. What about our behavior? Is our character made in the image of God? Rabbi Salanter says it can be if you fix it. So you've already got half the job done. Your body resembles God. That is to say, in the Jewish tradition, the mystical tradition, God is fully male, God is fully female. You are either male or female, or although today you obviously have more options than you had then, but nonetheless, most bodies are mostly male or female. But what about your character? So Rabbi Salanter says your character is a whole other story. That you have to make into the image of God. So by fixing your character, you draw yourself close to divinity. What's his approach? What does he say you're supposed to do to fix your character? So he creates this very, very interesting idea. He says, what people need is a new topic of study. They have to study the ancient books on changing character, but they have to study it in a way where it isn't another topic in the curriculum. They have to study it so it moves them. So he created a new institution. He called it the separated room. Two people would get together in a small room, usually connected to a yeshiva. It could be sets of two in different rooms, chanting very seriously soulful melodies. They would study books about traits of character, gratitude, patience, open-mindedness, generosity, courage. And they would ask each other, how are you doing on these traits? Have you had problems in these areas? But they would sing the study. Why singing? Because he felt it had to be moving. If it was all in the mind, it would just be another subject. And the two people would work together as partners and would try to be honest with each other and say, you know, today I got really angry and I'm really ashamed of myself. Why did you get angry, my friend? Well, because of such and such and such and such. Why did that anger you? I think today we'd probably call this applied psychoanalysis. But it's very interesting, and he created a whole series of these different traits that you could work on. The goal being more and more to get into control of your own life, to make your character resemble God, not just your body. Interestingly enough, this movement was also opposed. This man was a very famous rabbi. Unlike our first rabbi, Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer, the Baal Shem Tov, this rabbi was a Talmudic genius. But at a certain point, he felt that being a Talmudic genius wasn't going to help anybody. And he noticed that all the other very famous rabbis, they didn't treat people very well. A few of them did, but a lot of them didn't. They were very impressed that they were so famous. But they weren't very nice to people. And he began to realize they had to change their characters. So this is the movement we call Musar. There's been a resurgence of interest in this movement, by the way, today. There is a Musar Institute founded by Alan Marinas, which is a secularized version of many of these ideals, and you can find it on websites, etc., and he's created books about it as well. The basic idea is all men, all women, all children, all old people need to spend time every day, assessing their character. So I'd like to give you just some examples of this. Again, watching the clock here. I'm going to skip some of these and just give you some of the highlights. Each of the different authors who is in this tradition discusses traits of character in a different way. So I want to give you an example from Alan Morinas' book, Everyday Holiness. That particular example is about gratitude. It so happened that Morinas, himself a practicer of Musar, had decided that a certain week was a week devoted to trying to cultivate gratitude. Fine. He was teaching an online course, and a student wrote to him and said, I think your online course is a total sham. I want my money back. And he said, well, you knew what the course was when you signed up. I'll give you a partial refund. And she wrote back a very abusive email saying, what do you mean a partial refund? I pay for something. The something I pay for is no good. I want a full refund now. You're a fraud. So he's shocked. And he said, I was going to let her have it. And then I realized it was a week where I was supposed to work on my trait of gratitude. I was so upset. So what could I do? How could I be grateful? I was thinking, my first response was, I'll write her an email saying, I am so grateful to you because you've shown me just what an idiot you can. No, can't do it. So he said, I worked and I worked. What could I be grateful to her for? And then he realized there was something. She had really shown him what her reality about this course felt like. And he began to think, if I had bought a toaster and the toaster really didn't work, wouldn't I go back to the store and say, your toaster doesn't work. I'd want my money back. So he gave her her money back, and he felt she had actually taught him something, how to see something from somebody else's perspective, that you can be grateful for that. I personally have a need of lots of work in these areas, so I find this very, very interesting. Another example about anger. One of the great masters of Musar found that he often got angry. So he decided getting angry was a very bad thing to do. It seemed to indicate a disapproval of God's creation. So he made a vow to himself. He would only allow himself to burst into anger if he was wearing a particular garment, which was at home. So whenever he was out, either in the yeshiva or in the marketplace, and he couldn't. He had to go home and put the garment on first. Then he could scream and yell. A more modern rabbi said, I didn't have time to get a garment. It was a good idea, but I could never make it. I was too far away at my office. So I devised a portable solution, rubber bands. I was only allowed to be angry if I had rubber bands around. So I could carry them with me, but sometimes I forgot them. And just when I didn't have my rubber bands, so I couldn't get angry. The rabbi said this actually worked. He found that over time, he didn't get angry as quickly. Something kept getting in the way of the anger. He began to change his character. Another example, understanding that all of us see things from our own perspective. How do you fix that? You don't fix it, right? So one rabbi says you don't fix it, but you become aware of it. When you have to make a serious decision with big repercussions that affects your own interests, have in your head a list of 3 of your close friends who you regard as relatively sane people who are not involved in your decision. Go to each one and ask him or her what to do. Then go by the majority. It's a very interesting idea. You're not going to fix yourself, but you can still behave better. And maybe behaving better does change you. I happen to like the next one particularly. So I'll just confess this. It's not Alcoholics Anonymous, but how about traffic jams analysis, right? So anonymous. So I have a tremendous trouble with traffic jams. I drive around a lot for my work, and I get stuck in traffic jams, and somehow my wife stays married to me. She's obviously a saint. Anyway, traffic jams are not my friend. What do you do about a traffic jam? I mean, you're stuck. How do you cultivate patience? So one of the things that Alan Morinas says in the name of this rabbi, I'm quoting Rabbi Pear, he says, certainly you do need to get somewhere on time, and when you're in a traffic jam, you may not make it. There's nothing to do about that. You can't fix the traffic. But you do have just that little moment of responsibility before you let yourself give in to your own impatience. The impatience wells up, and there's this split second where you could see it coming and say, I am not going to give in to impatience. I control my life. not my impatience. I'm not a machine. My characters and patterns are powerful, but I have some say in this. I'm going to fight against this. He uses an expression of Rabbi Pear, recognizing the space between the match and the fuse. It's a very interesting expression. I think it works for anger, but it also works for impatience. You do have some free will. One more example, and I'll stop. This is an odd one. Recognizing the face of others. A Musar teacher named Rabbi Shlomo Volbe says, according to the mystics, every face is one of the faces of God. Each face is unique. God is one, but God's oneness is testified to by the exact difference of all people. So that's a bit of a paradox, but let's run with it for a second. How can you recognize God in each person? It turns out to be very simple. You have to say hello to them. He has a practice where you make it your job to say hello to 3 people you meet at random during a day. And he says, you might find this is very hard. You're shy. You don't know somebody. You feel, oh, if I say hello, am I recognizing them, me, such an important person? Am I giving them honor? He says, all of that's irrelevant. You're just saying hello. You're just being friendly. It doesn't mean anything except you're a friendly human being recognizing another human being. What I find profound is, I think this is very hard. It's so simple. He records a story, Rabbi Volbe does, of being a young student going to a yeshiva where somebody says, oh, I'm so glad you're here. Please come in and have something to drink. And the next person said, oh, I'm so glad you're here. And he realized it was the practice of everyone there to go out of their way to say hello. It's a very interesting, very small teaching, but in a way it's the same thing. We aren't destined to be the same tomorrow as we are today. There is some freedom there to fix it. So I want to thank you so far for putting up with this talk. I've tried to give you a lot of information in a short space of time. I want to end with a concluding thought from a completely different thinker. He is an inheritor of both traditions. This is Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook. He is a mystic, an Israeli mystic, died in 1935. And he has a very interesting thought about what it means to be a human being. And I wanted to end with it because I think it will, in many ways, summarize this talk. I'll just read it to you. The natural remorse that burns in the heart as an expression of the desire to return to God, to return to righteousness, this natural remorse derives from the anguish felt by the soul because the soul has remained static. Instead of meeting its need always to ascend toward higher levels. And surely this is the case if the soul feels that it has suffered rather decline. The anguish caused by remaining static pierces to the depths of the soul, and the pain is very great. I want to end with this because this sort of comes back to what we started with. You don't have to be a guru or guru wannabe or even anything other than just a normal person to catch hold of the idea that your life has a lot of questions you haven't answered, that you're finite, that you don't have the whole story. Rabbi Kook is saying here in this quotation at the end, when we stay static, when we don't let ourselves ask the bigger questions, the 360-degree questions, the large questions, when we remain static, we're in pain. Because our souls, our essence, if you want to put it that way, was made to ascend to something higher. But I have to be careful. The minute you say that, you sound like you're on some high spiritual plane. I can definitely testify I am on no high spiritual plane. But I get the point. If you don't grow spiritually, you can feel, well, what am I doing here? What's this all about? It can become very oppressive in a way. So you can allow yourself to ask the question, either from the pain of being static or just from a sense that there's a bigger picture. What is the bigger picture? I've given you 2 possible Jewish answers, and Judaism is very big. They always say the essence of Judaism is 2 Jews, 3 opinions. So that being the essence of Judaism, there are many answers, but I've given you 2 answers to how to cultivate an answer to that question of a bigger picture. One of them is an ecstatic closeness to God, not through study, but through the beautiful world God made, through closeness with God. And the other is discovering a kind of, I want to put it this way in quotation marks, something like an inner divine spark, by seeing that you can be free to some degree to shape your own character and how it affects your life and the life of others. Thank you very much for having my talk.
Thank you so very much. It was delightful, fascinating, and there's so much food for thought, so much to reflect, and the stories that make us think and also remind us of other stories that we may have heard. And so there is a lot, and so we will have opportunity to discuss this further and have your comments and questions after the service when we meet in the sitting room. So feel free to ask Dr. Meskin whatever questions you have, the comments you want to make. And so then your next visit is going to be sooner than 13 years. That's for sure, yeah. Next Sunday, so we'll have our annual Freedom Festival. We normally do it on July 4th, but this time July 4th comes in the middle of the week, so we have decided to do it on Sunday next. So as we do every year, we'll have prayer, meditation, we'll have some reflection on the idea of freedom, or what it means in not just in a political sense, but in every other way as well. And then we will have potluck lunch. More Indian vegetarian food, so you're welcome next Sunday as well. And in the week, we will continue with the study of the Kathopanishad on Wednesday, as we do every week. And then Tuesday and Saturday, our meditation will also continue as usual. So let's conclude with a prayer now on page 3. May the Divine Being, who is the Father in heaven of the Christians, Holy One of the Jewish faith, Allah of the Muslims, Buddha of the Buddhists, Tao of the Taoists, Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, the Great Spirit of the Native Americans, and Brahman of the Hindus, lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May we be granted strength, freedom, and clear understanding. May we learn to see God in our own hearts and in everyone around us. May God bless us all and fill our hearts with gratitude, grace, and love. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.